Welcome to Wheelchair Mafia, still in action at 93 years old? Sonny Franzese. This is a story about a man who cheated death, prison, and the very concept of retirement. A man who, at an age when most are long gone or lost in memories, was still a feared underboss of one of New York's most notorious crime families. This is the story of John Sonny Franzese. How does a man remain a feared figure in organized crime at 93 years old? What kind of legacy, what kind of myth, keeps a man like Sonny relevant after decades in the mob? Was he working out of habit, an addiction to power, or a sheer, primal survival instinct? This book will answer these questions. We will journey deep into the life and mind of a man who was a living, breathing relic of the golden age of the American Mafia, a man whose continued presence posed a chilling question: does evil ever truly grow old? Join us as we pull back the curtain on the life of a man who was a legend, a monster, a father, and a betrayer. This is the story of how Sonny Franzese, even in a wheelchair, was still very much in action. Chapter 1. The Dawn in the Dock. The year is 2010. In a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, a place that has seen its share of mob royalty, an old man sits slumped in a wheelchair. He's frail, his eyes often closed, giving the impression of a man lost to the world. He is 93 years old. To the casual observer, he's a relic, a harmless grandfather figure who has somehow wandered into a scene of grave importance. But this is no ordinary old man. This is John Sonny Franzese, the underboss of the Colombo crime family. And he is on trial for extorting Manhattan strip clubs and a Long Island pizzeria. Imagine this for a moment. At 93, when life for most is a quiet series of medical appointments and fading photographs, Sonny Franzese was, according to the FBI, still a significant player in the world of organized crime. The prosecutor's voice cuts through the courtroom hum, painting a picture not of a feeble nonagenarian, but of a ruthless predator. A man who, despite his age, still commanded enough fear to shake down businesses. A man who was still earning, still scheming, still a mobster. The trial of a 93-year-old mob underboss was a spectacle that both fascinated and horrified the public. It begged the question: why hadn't he stopped? The evidence presented is damning. Secretly recorded conversations reveal a man who is anything but retired. In one chilling piece of audio, captured years earlier but now echoing in the silent courtroom, Sonny is heard giving advice on murder. His voice, raspy with age, is steady and methodical as he describes his preferred method for making a body disappear. He said, "Today, you can't have a body no more. It's better to take that half an hour, to get rid of the body than it is to leave the body in the street." He goes on to detail a gruesome process involving a kiddie pool, a microwave, and a garbage disposal. The words hang in the air, a grotesque contrast to the image of the frail man in the wheelchair. This wasn't just a gangster. This was a man who had perfected the art of violence, a man who saw murder as a craft. But the most shocking moment of the trial is yet to come. The prosecution calls its star witness, a man who knows Sonny better than anyone. A man who shares his blood. As the witness takes the stand, Sonny appears to doze off. Perhaps it's a genuine moment of fatigue. Or perhaps it's the only way a man of his generation, a man who lived and breathed the code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, could cope with the ultimate betrayal. The witness is his own son, John Franzese Jr. This was more than just a trial. It was a Shakespearean drama playing out in real time. A father, a titan of the underworld, being brought down by the son who was supposed to carry on his name, if not his legacy. What could possibly lead to this? How does a man who inspired such loyalty and fear for decades find himself so utterly abandoned by his own flesh and blood? The answer to that question lies in the very foundations of the world Sonny Franzese built around himself. A world of power, fear, and secrets. And as we will see, that world was forged in the fires of a different era, an era when the Mafia was at the zenith of its power, and Sonny Franzese was one of its most handsome, charismatic, and deadly rising stars. The story of his longevity in crime begins not in a courtroom in 2010, but on the blood-soaked streets of post-war New York. Chapter 2. Forging a Legend, Building a Shield. To understand the man in the wheelchair, you have to understand the man who once commanded the Copacabana nightclub with just a look. Long before the walkers and the prison jumpsuits, Sonny Franzese was the epitome of the Hollywood mobster. He was handsome, with a powerful build and a magnetic charm that drew people in, from Hollywood starlets to Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. But beneath the polished surface was a man of terrifying violence. The U.S. Army had discharged him in 1942 for psychoneurotic with pronounced homicidal tendencies. The Army's loss was the Profassi family's, later the Colombo family's, gain. Sonny learned early that in his world, there were two currencies that mattered: money and fear. And they were inextricably linked. His rise through the ranks was fueled by a reputation for being a top earner and an unapologetic killer. Sonny wasn't just a thug. He was an innovator in the rackets. He saw opportunities everywhere, from the traditional domains of loansharking and extortion to the burgeoning music and film industries. He had a piece of the classic pornographic film, Deep Throat, a move that showcased his understanding of where culture and cash were heading. He invested in record labels, using his influence to promote singers and control jukebox distribution. This wasn't just crime, it was a dark, twisted version of venture capitalism. This ability to generate vast sums of money made him indispensable, but it was his capacity for violence that made him untouchable. Pause and consider. What would you have done if you were a small business owner in the 1960s, and a man with Sonny's reputation walked into your shop? You would pay, not just for protection from others, but for protection from him. His legend grew with every whispered story, every rival who disappeared, every cop who looked the other way. Authorities believed he was responsible for dozens of murders, but for decades, they could never make a charge stick. He was, in his own words, a master of making bodies disappear. This reputation became his shield. It was a brand, more effective than any army of lawyers. When Sonny Franzese's name was invoked, it carried the weight of decades of implied terror. Here's how the mythology shield worked. First, Sonny's power wasn't just in his actions, but in his story. Second, the more brutal his alleged deeds, the less he had to do to maintain control. Third, his charm was the lure, but his violent reputation was the hook. Finally, this mythology allowed him to project power far beyond his physical reach. Think of it like this: a lion in a cage is still a lion. Even when he was behind bars, which he would be for a significant portion of his life, his reputation preceded him. He could conduct business from a prison cell because the fear he had cultivated on the outside was still very much alive. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison in 1967 for his role in a series of bank robberies. It should have been the end of his story. For most mobsters, a sentence that long is a death sentence. They fade into obscurity, are forgotten, or are usurped. But not Sonny. He was paroled multiple times, and each time he went right back to the life. He was a creature of habit, but it was more than that. The Mafia was his identity. It was the only world he knew, the only place where his particular set of skills was valued. To leave it would be to become a nobody, and for a man like Sonny Franzese, irrelevance was a fate worse than death. This refusal to fade away, this constant return to the life, only added to his legend. He was the unkillable, unshakable embodiment of Cosa Nostra. Younger mobsters looked at him with a mixture of awe and reverence. He was a living link to the glory days, a symbol of defiance against the government. But this very legend, this shield he had so carefully crafted, would be tested in the most painful way imaginable. His family, the one thing a man in his position is supposed to hold sacred, would become the source of his greatest vulnerability. The seeds of his son's betrayal were sown in the very life Sonny had chosen. And as we will discover, the story of the Franzese family is a tragedy of operatic proportions, a tale of loyalty and love twisted into resentment and rebellion. It reveals the corrosive nature of a life built on secrets and violence, and how even the strongest bonds can be shattered. Chapter 3. The Sins of the Father. "I'm not talking about my father as a man," John Franzese Jr. told the court, his voice heavy with a lifetime of conflict. "I'm talking about the life he chose. I was immersed in it. I was born into it." This was the moment the myth of Sonny Franzese crashed headfirst into reality. The ultimate rule of his world, omerta, was being broken not by a rival or a disgruntled soldier, but by his own son. The man who lectured others on loyalty was now facing the ultimate disloyalty. Why would a son do this? The prosecution painted it as a man trying to do the right thing. But the truth was far more complex, a tangled story of pain, addiction, and a desperate search for identity. John Jr. grew up in the long, dark shadow of his father. While Sonny was a titan on the streets, he was often an absent figure at home, either holding court in social clubs or sitting in a prison cell. Junior was not cut out for the life. He was sensitive, and he lacked the cold-blooded nature that made his father a success in his chosen field. He fell into drug addiction, a weakness that made him a constant disappointment to a man who valued strength above all else. For years, John Jr. wore an FBI wire, secretly recording his father and other mobsters. Think about the psychological weight of that. Every conversation, every family dinner, every piece of fatherly advice was a potential piece of evidence. He was living a double life, betraying the man whose approval he had craved his entire life. He did it, he said, to get clean, to finally escape the gravitational pull of the mob life that had consumed his family and his soul. He needed money to pay off debts, and the FBI offered him a way out. Sonny had built a fortress of fear around himself, but he never realized the greatest threat was already inside the walls. His life's work had poisoned his own bloodline. The violence, the secrets, the paranoia. It all seeped into the foundation of his home. He demanded a medieval loyalty from his subordinates but failed to see the modern heartbreak in his own son's eyes. Let's look at what this betrayal truly reveals. The hollowness of honor. The Mafia projects an image of a brotherhood bound by honor and respect. Junior's testimony exposed this as a facade. When push came to shove, survival and personal pain trumped any notion of a sacred code. The generational gap. Sonny was a relic from an era where being a mobster was a source of power and pride. For John Jr.'s generation, it was a trap, a dead-end street that led only to prison or an early grave. The personal cost of a criminal life. Sonny's choices didn't just affect him. They created a vortex that pulled his entire family in. His wife, his children, they were all serving a life sentence alongside him, in one way or another. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized a hero from your childhood was deeply flawed? Imagine that feeling magnified 1,000 times. That was John Franzese Jr.'s reality. He had to destroy his father's world to save himself. At the trial, when his son testified, Sonny was asked by a reporter what he thought. He simply pointed to his cheek, a gesture for a kiss. A kiss of death. Even then, cornered and betrayed, his first instinct was the language of the mob. But it was a hollow threat from a man whose power, in that moment, had been rendered obsolete. The shield of mythology he had built over a lifetime had been pierced by the one person he should have been able to trust. The foundation of Sonny's world was his reputation, his adherence to the code. With his own son calling him a rat in open court, that foundation crumbled. And yet, he didn't stop. Even after this ultimate humiliation, even after being sent back to prison at 93, his story wasn't over. This raises the most fascinating question of all. What was left to fight for? The answer has little to do with money or rackets. It has everything to do with the man himself, and a force more powerful than any code or family bond. The profound, deep-seated addiction to being Sonny Franzese. Chapter 4. The addiction to power. Why didn't he just stop? After decades in prison, after his health failed, after his own son turned against him in the most public way imaginable, why did Sonny Franzese continue to be a mobster? Why was he still taking meetings, still collecting tributes, still enforcing the rules of a game he had already lost? To answer this, we have to look past the gangster and see the man. And what we find is not a simple criminal, but someone driven by a complex set of psychological forces. It wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of habit, identity, and a deep, insatiable hunger for relevance. First, consider the power of pure habit. For over 70 years, Sonny Franzese woke up every day as a member of La Cosa Nostra. It was his job, his social circle, his entire frame of reference. Asking him to stop being a mobster would be like asking a fish to stop swimming. It was the only life he knew. The rituals, the language, the constant assessment of threats and opportunities, it was all as ingrained in him as breathing. But it goes deeper than habit. It's about identity. Who was Sonny Franzese if he wasn't Sonny the mobster? Was he just John, the old man in the apartment? The thought was likely terrifying. His entire sense of self, his place in the world, was built on his reputation. He was the feared underboss, the living legend, the man who knew Sinatra. Without that, he was nothing. In psychology, this is sometimes called identity foreclosure, where an individual commits to an identity without ever exploring other options. Sonny didn't just choose the mob life, he became it. To retire would have been a form of suicide. And then there's the most potent driver of all, the addiction to power. Imagine walking into a room and having everyone fall silent. Imagine your name alone being enough to make people pay, to make them afraid, to make them obey. That is a drug more powerful than any narcotic. Sonny had tasted that power in his youth, and he never lost the craving for it. Even in his 90s, from his wheelchair, he could still summon that fear. Younger mobsters would visit him, seeking his blessing or his wisdom. They saw him as a king in exile. For Sonny, these moments were proof that he still mattered. He was no longer the physical threat he once was, but his name, his legend, still had currency. He was the last of his kind, and that title alone gave him a unique form of authority. Being feared was his lifeblood. It told him he was still alive. Was he respected, feared, or used in his later years? The answer is all three. He was respected as a living piece of history, a man who had never broken the code of omerta. He was feared for the violence he was still capable of ordering and for the ghost of the killer he once was. And he was likely used by younger, more ambitious mobsters who could operate under the cover of his legendary name, using him as a figurehead. So, was it obsession or persistence? It's a thin line. One could argue his persistence was a form of obsession. He was obsessed with the only identity that had ever given him meaning. He was holding on to a version of himself that the world had long since passed by. The Mafia of the 21st century was a shadow of its former self, weakened by RICO laws and internal betrayals. Yet, in his mind, Sonny was still the charismatic powerhouse from the 1960s. His continued presence says something profound about organized crime itself. The modern mob didn't have room for a 93-year-old underboss because it was strong. It had room for him because it was weak. It was clinging to its own myths, its own legends, just as much as Sonny was. He was a ghost from a bygone era, haunting a dying institution. His story was not just about a man who refused to quit. It was about a man who couldn't. His life and the life of the mob were one and the same. And as he entered his 100th year, the final act of his extraordinary, tragic, and cautionary tale was about to begin. It would not end in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet, final whisper of a world that had ceased to be. Chapter 5. A Ghost at the Table. In 2017, a remarkable event took place. John, Sonny Franzese was released from a federal prison medical center in Massachusetts. He was 100 years old, the oldest federal prisoner in the United States. As he was wheeled out into the free world, a world he no longer recognized, it marked the end of an era. This wasn't a parole. This was the government essentially acknowledging that he had finally outlasted the system. He had outlived his enemies, his rivals, his friends, and even his own sentence. He went to live with his daughter in Brooklyn. The feared underboss, the man whose name once terrified New York, was now simply a centenarian, dependent on his family for care. The power, the fear, the mythology, it all seemed to evaporate at the prison gates. So what is the final verdict on Sonny Franzese? Is his story a tragedy, a success, or a warning? In a way, it is all three. From one perspective, his life was an incredible success. In a profession where the retirement plan is often a bullet to the back of the head, he survived to be 102 years old. He beat dozens of murder charges, maintained his status through decades of imprisonment, and never, ever broke the code of omerta. By the brutal metrics of his own world, he won the game. He achieved a longevity that was, by all accounts, impossible. But it was also, undeniably, a tragedy. He outlived his own legend, only to become a caricature of it. His family was shattered. The son who should have carried his legacy instead ensured his final conviction. He sacrificed his family for the life, only to have that life crumble into irrelevance and betrayal. He held onto an identity that cost him everything that makes a life truly rich. What good is being the king if your kingdom is an empty room? And most importantly, his story is a warning. It's a warning about the seductive allure of power and the corrosive nature of a life built on fear. Sonny Franzese was different from other mobsters who faded or flipped. He didn't fade because his identity was too intertwined with the mob, and he didn't flip because his belief in the code, or perhaps his fear of irrelevance, was absolute. He was a true believer in a faith that had long since lost its gods. His life reveals the stagnation of the American Mafia. It wasn't evolving, it was decaying. The fact that it had a place for a 93-year-old underboss wasn't a sign of respect for its elders. It was a sign that there was no new blood, no new vision, only ghosts sitting around a table, telling stories of a time when they were giants. Pause and consider this final question. What made Sonny Franzese so different? It was his unwavering, obsessive belief in his own myth. He wasn't just playing a role, he believed in it, heart and soul. He was the last of the true believers, a man who saw omerta not as a rule, but as a religion. Sonny Franzese died in 2020 at the age of 102. He didn't die in a hail of gunfire or on the orders of a rival. He died quietly, of natural causes. In the end, the one enemy no mobster can ever defeat, time itself, finally came to collect. The story of the wheelchair mafia is not just about a stubborn old man. It is a story about identity, loyalty, and the slow, inevitable decay of a dark American dream. It shows us that a life built on fear ultimately ends in isolation, and that even the most powerful legends eventually fade into silence. Sonny Franzese held on for as long as he could, a ghost at the table, a chilling reminder that while a man can build a fearsome legacy, he can never outrun the person he truly is, or the world that he leaves behind.